Well, here we are, finally talking about Freemasonry and the connections to all sorts of scary stuff. Again, let me start with saying that I don't believe that Freemasons are automatically going to hell. I'm not here to judge anybody. I have lots of friends who are still involved in the Freemasons, and I just hope that I can share my experience and education to either help people leave it, recognize what they're involved in, or not get involved to begin with, which would be the best, to just not get involved. So how does one actually get involved? For me, it was a lifelong event, I guess you could say. It took a long time for me to become initiated into the Masons, not because of being withheld for any reason by them, but because I wasn't quite there. And they worked on me for years and years and years. And that's what they do. They do not give up. And a lot of them don't mean it maliciously. They think they're helping. They want to help you out. And that's how a lot of people are brought in, because the Masons really do have amazing follow through. That is one of the brilliant things about the organization. So first, before I was involved as a Freemason in the Order of the Eastern Star, where I was an officer, I was a psychic for many, many, many Freemasons. When I was saved, at that point, I had a Rolodex of probably 3,000 people that were clients. And these were not like every day, every week, not like that, but a lot of people. And it was my life. And I'm not saying that to exaggerate. I'm just sharing how extreme that was for me. That was my living. I made a living as a psychic. And, the dance world just never really quite covers the bills. So I learned a lot about Masons before I even became one. And they fascinated me. They're absolutely fascinated with metaphysics, with psychics, with numerology, with astrology, with demonology. They get together and talk about books like The Disappearance of the Universe. They even would get together and talk about the books I wrote, which have been pulled off the market. So it is definitely a brotherhood, and it is a lifestyle. The Masons really stick together as a group. And I didn't see that as clearly until I became one. And then it was like, whoa, this is pretty obvious. At least it was to me. But they came to me individually. They came to me as groups. The Masons have lots of little intricate small groups, different clubs within their clubs. Some groups even have just a book club or a cigar club that meets and talks about conspiracy theories. They love to talk about conspiracy theories. So all of these things they would bring to my office and ask me about. And they love to talk about investments and especially Bitcoin. But I'm still fascinated with a lot of conspiracy theories, don't get me wrong. But at that time, I was definitely deep into the crazy demonic world of witchcraft, of the New Age, and which ultimately connects to satanic bases of a lot of things. So a lot of people try to push that, Masonry is not a religion. I can say that it is. Unfortunately, I can clearly see that now, and it's a bummer. One of the things that I noticed recently when I was taking video is on the sidewall of the lodge I was a member of, pictured here, there's a name that I'm zooming in on because I actually know this person. He's a friend of mine, and it's the symbol for alchemy. And this particular person is very fascinated with magic, sorcery, and I was even commissioned by them to paint pictures with pyramids. I used to do a lot of paintings for the Masons as well. I was an inspired psychic artist, and I painted some pretty cool out there stuff, but I don't promote it now. And I have not picked up a paintbrush for a long time because I don't want to open that door. So interesting things like that. And then I would do a painting for them. They would call them psychic paintings, and they would even often ask if they could watch me do the painting, and they'd sit around and talk about all the things hidden in the painting. And do you see that symbol? And do you see that sign? And I was just going for it. I enjoyed painting, and then I would step back and kind of get into it with them at times, because a lot of artists recognize that they check out when they do creation art. So it's kind of a slippery slope, I guess. I'm not saying being an artist leads to demonic possession, but in my case, I definitely was working through the psychic elements and skills that was my life. So that's a lot of what I would do for those guys. They would come and talk to me a lot about aliens. Very, very obsessed with the Book of Enoch. And I think the Book of Enoch is great. It's historical. Those of you who don't know my background, my degree field is English literature and Latin. And I love to study. I'm just a big geek. That's what I do. I sit at home and read and study and call pastors and ask them questions until I've exhausted them. But the Book of Enoch is really fascinating. A lot of people are like, why isn't it in the Bible? Well, it's Apocrypha. And that means it doesn't line up consistently, but there's a lot of good information in there. And again, I am not a pastor. I'm not a minister. Just loving the Bible, loving Jesus, and become a believer just changes your perspective, and it's causing me to go through my brain and all these experiences and go, whoa, wait, that makes sense now. So a lot of the things that confused me before, like the Book of Enoch, which kind of pulled me away from Christianity because I was buying into the new age of their description of Jesus in different books. And that ultimately brought me into agreement with the Masons. And so that's important to explain, is that my new age world and witchcraft lined up beautifully with the Masons, and it's designed that way. It's absolutely 100% designed that way. And interesting thing that people don't know, that's common about the Masons, is that they're still involved in a lot of money and financial stuff. And the original Freemasons and the Knights would help the pilgrims to go to Jerusalem from all over the world and help them travel safely. And they also were like the first bank system. So they would stash money along the way in all different forms, all different currencies. So if a Mason ever needed help, he could stop and say help, just like he can today, give signs, symbols, passcodes, words, even show membership cards now, and they'll help you. And so that's how one of the factions of the Masons. So there's a lot that goes into the Masons, not just the current way that they get together now. It's still the old ways exist, but the deeper and longer somebody's in Masonry, the more they learn about those pieces that go way, way, way back. So the psychic work I did really tied into everything Masonic. And so when I did my back research recently over these last months, almost a year now, it's like, oh my goodness, this makes so much more sense. Including the satanic witchcraft tie, which is just an absolute bummer because I have so many friends that are involved and they really don't know what they're involved in. Again, I want to reiterate that. Now, the higher up and the deeper people are in, they know what they're involved in. And here's an interesting thing. The people that are really, really high up are not professing Christians. And I noticed that. And that got my attention at the end of my service in the Masons. And recently, I've been putting those pieces together. And that, I think, is very important because that's going to come into play when we talk about the symbols and signs within Masonry. So again, they love to talk about magic. They love to talk about aliens. They believe fully in sorcery and psychics and all of this stuff. And so for me, it was like, hey, I fit in. But then when I was saved, I was already within the Masons group. So it took me a minute to see. That's why for me, there was that conflict. Now I have back information because as an active witch and a psychic, I was able to see things that I understand most people wouldn't notice, because as most, like I said, are professing Christians, they're going to see all the things that are in their mind glory to God, including their delusion that the G that's in the middle of the pyramid oftentimes, or between the square and compass, they believe stands for God. It does not. I'm telling the truth here. So unfortunately, that can really pull people in and mislead them until their education goes higher and higher and higher. And for the Order of the Eastern Star in particular, women never learn a lot of this stuff unless they go to these other like small group meetings or they're a psychic Masons come to. So that kind of leads me into that information. Again, people want to know, what did they ask you as a psychic? Well, it came back to a lot of their signs and symbols. They would come to me and say, oh, I had a dream about this, or I need to know if I should vote on this person. And so when they vote, it's all or none when somebody is voted in or out of Masons. And you can't recruit in Masonry. People have to ask to become a Mason. So it's a real interesting process how somebody gets to that place. And these small group meetings, they do sit around and talk about potential recruits and how do we invite them in and how do we expose them to this. And so it's very sneaky and really manipulative when you look at it at the end of the day. And that's ultimately how they got me in. And because every time I would read for anybody, they'd be like, why aren't you a member? Why aren't you a member? And for a long time, I was able to say, oh, I'm not married. You know, because typically Order of the Eastern Star, you have to be married to a man who is a Mason. And I ended up getting involved because of my grandfather connection. And so that was another interesting piece that came up when they wanted to initiate me, because the original law was in Masonry was that if a woman wanted to become an Order of the Eastern Star member, she had to be direct connection to either married to a Mason or her dad or uncle or brother had to be a Mason. So they started spreading the rules thinner and thinner as they were losing membership over the years. And so now they're seeing their membership go up again. But there's also this young man membership that's going up again because men are looking for fraternity. And that's a big push that's happening. So instead of men running to the cross and the patience of prayer, they're running to ceremony with the Masons. And because these ceremonies are pretty heavy duty, they work. And it is a nepotistic club. They help each other out in ways that, you know, I'm not going to say are illegal, but they definitely circumvent the legal system at times with their own tribunals and also within their support system, because so many members are from the military, retired cops, current cops, and all that good stuff. So they help each other out, but it's under the guise of brotherhood, not nepotism necessarily. But that is a part of it, and that does get deeper for the people who are involved in the heavier groups. So there's the first aspect of being a Mason, which is like, you know, the 33rd degree, but then there's Knights Templar, Scottish Rite, etc. And then there's a lot of girl groups that people don't realize are involved for young women. There's the Rainbow Girls, there's Job's Daughters, and there's also programs for young men. So they're getting them in there early on and training them in these ceremonies. In fact, Job's Daughters has a ceremony that is called in the Bethel room, is actually what they call their ceremony room. And Bethel, like Bethel. So just putting that out there. They would ask me about things they weren't supposed to. I came to find out after I became a Mason in these like readings with me, they would ask me about people that were getting ready to get voted on, even at the national and international level. They often did not give me full names, and I didn't remember or write things down. That wasn't my concern. And even if I do have a memory of some names, I'm not going to give them away because that's still private. And it's up to anybody who wants to expose themselves for their experience like I'm doing. I can talk about me and what I personally saw and did and know, but I'm not going to expose anybody else. I just don't think that that's right. So that's where I'm coming from. And that's why I love them. These are great people for the most part. Like I said, it's the really high up where you start seeing the icky, seedy darkness really show up. And the Knights Templar, unfortunately, is one of those things. So they would come to me, like I said, and ask if they should vote yes or no on a person, or should this person be initiated to this level, this degree? Should we put this person in this officer role? It would be questions all over the place. And like I said, investments, they would ask me about relationships. And I also did a lot of training. They had me come in and teach a lot of transcendental what they called, medicine. So I did transcendental meditation with these guys. Sorry, again, this is before I was saved, people. Please remember that. And I taught them all sorts of magic that they had another aspect to that they would bring to the table, which I thought was cool at the time because I was like, yeah, this lines up with what I'm doing and it makes it better and bigger and it's all bright and fluffy and butterflies. And they would kind of bring it to me that way. And a lot of them meant well. A lot of them didn't know what they were getting into. So let me put that out there as well. But magic is magic and it's dangerous. So I started doing really high level magic with these guys even before I became initiated in the Order of the Eastern Star. So the signs and symbols were things that I was comfortable with and I was aware of. And it wasn't until I was saved that I started to take that step back and go, wait a second, something's really off here. So as far as the psychic work, that's a quick overview. I mean, I could talk, I guess, a long time about their specific questions and what I did for them. But the bottom line was they were really interested in the high level metaphysical aspects of what I knew, of what I could teach, what I could give them. That was a big deal to them. They loved to talk about books, metaphysical books, astrology, majorly into astrology, big time, big time, big time. And so that leads us into Masonic education. So they have their meetings often, it's like their main meeting like once a month, but they get together once a week oftentimes. It's not required. And then they have small groups that get together, and then their offshoot groups like the Knights Templar. Or Scottish Rite, or. So the G has 3 meanings actually in Masonry. And they like to tell people that, oh, it stands for God before they get in. But it actually stands for the Great Architect or geometry. There's about 5 occultic meanings that they attach to this. But those are the 2 that are really important to discuss because they kind of have, they have Phoenician roots that they try to say, oh, we took it off the Hebrew. So they try to take everything off of King David through his son Solomon, but they keep the good stuff of Solomon. They forget what happened with Solomon. And that's where I started, as a reader, I was invested in this before I was saved and didn't see the issue, the conflict, right? Because I was part of the conflict. Sorry. Really, I am sorry. I don't mean that flippantly. It's just like when you look back on it, you're like, oh, it's really obvious, avoidable, and unnecessary. And so here we are. So they often refer to the G as the Grand Master, Grand Architect, or the Great Lord. And in Knights Templar, when they have the G lit up in the temple, which looks like it is a neon sign. It looks kind of silly when you retrospectively look at it. But there's a symbol of Baphomet they bring out. And they try to disperse this meaning in a gentle way to new members that are being initiated in Knights Templar. But here's the issue. Knights Templar has kind of some dark roots about how you're invited into that. And oftentimes it has to do with protecting somebody from the law, typically with some type of sexual exploit, assault, illegal activity. Now, I'm not saying that's for everybody, but there is a commonality in people who have been inducted into Knights Templar. I personally had an experience before I left the lodge where I was assaulted in a way, and I don't want to go into it because it's not important now, but it was bad. And I didn't go to the police because that's not what you do when it's a Mason upon Mason. I went to the worshipful master. Okay, and that's what they call the Grand Master of the lodge. And they oftentimes leave out the master and they just call him worshipful. That's creepy if you really think about that, because in Satanism, that's how they refer to their hierarchy, as well as the Illuminati, and the Illuminati hijacked, of course, Masonry. So put it all together. So I went to the higher up and I thought I was doing the right thing. And I was like, hey, this happened. I didn't tell anybody else. I'm just telling you because I care about this person and I think he needs help. So instead of this person being talked to, reprimanded, saying, hey, don't do that, they had an emergency meeting, which is typically how it happens, I found out, and initiated him like 3 nights later in Knights Templar, to the point where they had to call people from other cities to be here, to have enough Knights Templar to initiate this person. I was devastated. And it was like, wait a second, I came into this group for support. I thought this was brotherhood. So that was about a year before I got out. And I was so hurt, and I was already so invested that I didn't connect all the pieces at that time. But I put them in the back of my brain, and I tried to avoid those people. And you would think that my group would not invite this person that's not even part of that particular group to our parties that we would have, and they went out of their way to make sure he was there in the future. And I thought that was really unsettling, because the person I had told was the person who invited him. And I watched that manipulation, and of course they were just watching to see if I was gonna tell anybody. And and legally I think there's a year in Montana for statute of limitations where you can report the person. And interestingly enough, it was almost a year later that I officially left the Freemasons. So it was like, I found out later that they actually were getting together and doing ceremony and spell work. They're into spell work, and they talk about that openly, to protect me and this other person from ourselves, basically. What does that sound like? Not Christianity. And so those are some things that started to show up that I put together that I couldn't believe really happened in this environment. I was like, wow. But then at the same time, I started to see it. So there you go. So a lot of the people I read for, as far as their background, they were all, interestingly enough, had been worshipful masters. And anybody who's been a Grand Master, it's like the first thing they like to tell you. If they find out you are a Mason or were a Mason, they love to tell you their credentials right away. There's a lot of ego and pride attached to their jewelry, their rings, and their roles as officers. And that's a very occultic behavior to tie in and to make your value be in that role or of that badge you're wearing around your neck during ceremony. It's strange. But I mean, I had people that were, military, politicians, a lot of politicians, attorneys, brokers, like I said, cops, you name it. But that's a lot of what I did with those guys, and it wasn't much different than a lot of the people I read for. Just they were Masons and they liked the higher magic. The difference is that is the piece that brought me in deeper, and so that's where we'll go, is from there. So here's a quick video of downtown Hamilton and where the lodge currently exists that I went to. You would never know, looking at this pretty quiet downtown, that there's a lot of deep and some dark history. My dance, tumbling, and martial arts school was in a building just over here where this car is passing. And what's interesting about that is there was a water burst 20 years ago, and they had to go underneath my studio, and it turned out there was tunnels underneath the town, and we'd heard about them as kids but had never seen them. And the tunnels ran under my studio, and they ran over here to where I am now by the post office. This is the old post office. And towards the Druid Valley. We'll just go ahead and 360 with you guys here in my cute town. But what's interesting is behind my studio is the Masonic Temple. Now there's an alleyway separating the two, but there's also a tunnel connecting the two. The tunnels have since been filled in when they found all the water bursts in town. It all kind of happened at one time. So unfortunately, there's no more underground tunnel system. The tunnels were put into place for political movement. There was a lot of brothels in Hamilton. It was founded by a man named Marcus Daly, Copper King. And so a lot of gambling. This whole downtown was just basically brothels and gambling. And a lot of political figures had to be moved quietly and privately, so they used the underground tunnels. And this actually happened into the 1900s. Also, the Freemasons had a very big seat here in this particular town, and it is still a very substantial Masonic lodge. and an important temple for a lot of gatherings. So they used the tunnels to not only move people through downtown to the houses of ill repute, but they also moved people literally in and out of town to an area called the Stock Farm, which is now still an elite environment. A story for another day. But it's all connected, and that's what's really interesting. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of tour here, and I apologize for my bumpy cameramanship, but I'm going to do my best to show you where we're at and what we're looking at. So, all right, this is the front of the temple, but we're actually going to go down the alleyway here. We came from this direction. There's the back entrance of my studio, and underneath, between that and this building to the left, is a tunnel that splits off and goes to several of these businesses actually. Of course, we're in the back way. But what's interesting is all the government buildings that connect. So here's the library, and then you have the back alley next to the fire department, and then you have the back entrance to the temple lodge. And it doesn't look like much when you look at the front and the back, but we just walked a half a block, and that is the length of this building. It is a half a block from street to alley. And to give you an idea of distance across, it's on 4 crossway lots. The windows up there are right above in the actual temple room, the main temple space where I used to be part of ceremony. So up there. So they classify this section, this would be the east wall. Technically it's not the east, but in the temple it doesn't matter, it's the east wall. So if I were to take you inside there, what you would see upon walking in, if you were looking at that from the inside out, would be the throne seats where the Grand Master and his cronies sit. And there's a ton of lights they turn on that almost looks like a neon situation. It doesn't look right, let me just tell you that much. There's a back entrance, it goes in through the basement, and then another couple of secret entrances that are accessible in different ways. So there's a full basement, and it actually goes down a couple of levels, and believe it or not, there's a second and third level above the adjacent side of the temple towards the front. There's a lot of rooms in these buildings. They can house a substantial amount of people, especially if there was like an emergency or type of fallout. So a lot of reasons why they have these this way, but again, this comes back to the basic design of what they try to classify as Solomon's temple, but we're gonna get deeper in and hopefully expose how it's more like a satanic temple established on the roots of Pergamon. I hope you enjoyed that little video of the lodge. And I wanted to point out that Solomon was the one who took over the lodge built the temple. Okay, so David told his son, King David's like, I'm not allowed to build the temple. God told me because I had all these wars and death upon my hands, I couldn't be the one to build the temple, but you need to build the temple. So Solomon started out with great intentions from the Lord. And all the proportions of the temple, I think it was like 60 by 20 by 30 cubits was the dimensions that were required. And so it started out being for God and in honor of his father. But what happened was Solomon was hijacked by demons. And he talks about talking to demons. And he invoked 72 demons apparently with his ring. And that was the big thing about Solomon's ring, which has a symbol on it that is often attributed to King David, the Solomon temple, the Star of David, but actually goes back to some of these demons. And so that was a big issue. So Solomon actually started turning this beautiful project into a very demonic temple. And he brought everybody along for the ride. And so it actually was a big deal that all these demons started becoming a part of their ceremony and of their worship. And that's actually what went forward into the Masons. And that's just a very short snippet. I'm sure you can do your own research into all of that. There's a lot of great stuff out there. But the point is that the Masons have convince themselves that they're still a part of this old order, that it's the way it's supposed to be. And they're afraid to really dig into the origins of it, which go back to even the Muslim Brotherhood and witchcraft and Satanism and Catholicism. So the one world order, the one currency, global currency, Bitcoin maybe being a warning, just saying. But at the same time, they'll get together and talk about the mark of the beast. So they try to throw these false flags because that's how Satan works. He has enough people in there that believe everything that they believe, myself being one of them, that the good guys come across continuing as good. I hope that made sense. But the building itself is actually really, really important to the Masons. They make a very big deal out of it because they believe it is biblical. And in a lot of ways it is, but they forget to look at where the temple went forward, what ended up happening with the temple, and what was it absolutely used for in the end. And so there's a lot of conflict there because that's where the Eye of Providence shows up and all these pieces that actually come from Pergamum. And so there's a lot of deep history that connects all these pieces and all these symbols. And the Eye of Providence and the pyramid are definitely not Christian. And the Masons make a huge deal out of it. And that's what was brought into the temple through the Middle East when Solomon was starting to work with all of these demons. And in the temple, in the Masonic temple, they actually have all these names, but they uplift them. They refer to it as good stuff. So I was talking about earlier with the Knights Templar, they actually have an emblem of Baphomet that they bring out, but it's not available unless you're part of that group or unless you look up and notice. One of the things I noticed after I woke up was all the symbols in the lodge that weren't lit up during certain ceremonies that didn't align with Christianity or God at all, including the pentacle, which is in front of everybody's face as the Order of the Eastern Star symbol, but they try to explain it away as, oh, it's the star in the east. And so it's flipped upside down like the Star of Venus. They'll often use that explanation, which is complete bull. Okay, it's absolutely a lie. They don't even know what they're talking about, I realize half the time. So myself included, because there's so many cross information that is not accurate or consistent that it keeps you confused enough to stay within the system. And that's what it is, a system. And so what's interesting is how important their building is to them. And so that's why I really wanted to show that video of the location, how big a building it is in a very small town, and all that interesting stuff. And they hang out there. You know, they really do use those buildings and hang out with each other. And after I was initiated, I noticed what big blabbermouths they are. They couldn't wait to tell me anything and everything they knew once I became initiated. It was like, you're in the club and they just drop all this stuff on you. And it was interesting to hear, but I also thought it was interesting to hear. And I learned about Meriwether Lewis, and I actually went to Helena to the Masonic Museum because I was a member at the time and I was able to go in to this Grand Lodge museum, which was really cool, but creepy because it looked like a satanic temple. And I actually took a picture of Meriwether Lewis's apron. He was reportedly wearing it when he was shot. And so there's actually blood stain on it, as seen here. And yeah, so he was a Mason, and Montana got a hold of, it was donated or whatever to Montana because Montana's really big in Freemasonry. So it ended up in our lodge, or in the Helena Lodge, and I took a picture of it. But here's a better picture of it, and you can see all the symbols on it. It's made out of silk, and it was gifted to him from very high up. There's great history behind it and all the signs and symbols that are written on it, and I'll add the link in the description so that you can go research it for yourself, because it is really interesting stuff to look into. But yes, Meriwether Lewis was a Master Mason, and they, you know, along with him, they tried to dismiss the all-seeing eye, as Christians were starting to call it out for decades and decades. People have been calling these signs and symbols out. So I find that kind of interesting. But they tried to dismiss it as a symbol of, not of God himself, but as, you know, of his omnipresence. And so then when I became a member of the Order of the Eastern Star, I noticed all the Muslim connections with the Order of the Eastern Star and the Eye of Providence, and actually the ancient connections of, you know, Egypt and India. And again, I was a witch, so before I was saved, and so all these signs didn't really bother me initially because I knew what they meant. It wasn't until I realized that they didn't know what they meant that there was a problem. And it's like, I'm in a cult. Uh-oh. So there's more on that. But so I thought you might find that interesting about Meriwether Lewis. And there are a lot of people who are were famous people that were Freemasons. And there is a concern about people who are Freemasons because there is a huge political influence and where their belief system lies. And that's the issue, is they, you know, show themselves to be doing good things, but and that's again the lower levels, the initiated levels. But when you get higher up in these higher groups and they start even pushing, you know, to write letters for people to be judges, they push for political seats, all of that stuff, that's a concern because they're not coming from a very sacred place at the end of the day. And that's what I think is really dangerous, and that's what I'm speaking to. And once you're initiated, male or female, they invite you to everything. And they like to tell you everything, even though they're not supposed to. So it's really interesting. And like I said, these are great people, great big hearts, really intelligent people. And that's often the case, that highly intelligent people get involved because they're looking for more. They're looking for that esoteric knowledge. They want that Gnosticism. They want something more. They want to go into the temple. And this is Mystery Babylon. I'm telling you. And so it's true about the pyramid, unfortunately. I used to defend all this stuff, and now it's like, oh, this isn't good. And it's all, when it's all talked about, it often sounds like, oh, these are all little things that just don't matter. But when you add them up, they definitely matter. And so when I became a member, that's where my story becomes heavier. And actually, I'm grateful because it pushed me towards my relationship with Jesus as opposed to away from it, because I had this background, I believe. And that was my experience. I know everybody has a different history and understanding, and so I'm not here to judge them. Again, anybody who is currently involved. And I think if you have family members that are involved, pray for them. Just pray for them that they can see the light, that they can see the truth. Because Masons like to push the whole light aspect. They push the great light about, oh, we're in the truth. And as we know, Satan likes to disguise himself as an agent of light, as do his demons. So when I was initiated, the ceremony is so intoxicating that you don't really know what's happening. And before you know it, you're making a commitment before you even know what the commitment is. But you're hooked, you're in, you're like, oh, this is so beautiful, this is so interesting, this is so wonderful, this is right, this feels good. And it's just intense. I can't even explain it. It's intense, and you like it because it's magic. It's magic. Magic feels good. So The ladies of the labyrinth are oftentimes what the Eastern Star officers are referred to in the actual pentagram that's in the center of the temple. So when somebody's initiated, they actually go through a labyrinth, which is not biblical at all. And in fact, it's warned about again in, in the Bible. It is warned against. Let me grab my notes. The actual labyrinth about in John chapter 4:24. Philippians talks about it in chapter 3, and even Psalm 29:2 is referring to making sure that our focus is on God and not like all these acts to get to God, because the labyrinth is a very witchy thing to do. I know, because I used to perform labyrinth ceremonies several times a year, in particular on New Year's, and we called in demons. I used to work with demons. I can admit that now. Demonology and necromancy are a real thing, and the Masons love to work with the Book of Enoch and a lot of the names in the Necronomicon, and that's the 72 demons, and they are high level, dangerous demons. And this stuff is even warned against, when the Catholic priests are told not to do this stuff. Like they're doing acts of against God when they're doing these exorcisms and whatnot. And even deliverance ministry is on this slippery slope, because only Jesus can deliver, not man. Man can't do that, but man can invoke demons for sure. And if you're not filled with the Holy Spirit, you can be possessed. And I've witnessed this, unfortunately. It's awful. And it's not like the Exorcist movies where people's heads are spinning. It's different. It's slower, it's seductive, and dare I say, sexy. And that's why people like it. We don't even know that you're intoxicated with all of this magic until you have your adi moment. Here's the deal. After I was initiated and went through this labyrinth and gave this oath and blah, 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 and was told all these signs and secrets, like the first night, the color means this, and the sign is this, and the pass is that. It was like, wow, okay, this is just like witchcraft. And I liked it. So I was like, great, I resonate with this. So immediately they put me in an officership role because one person was moving up. And so they moved me into the seat of Electa, which is the red point of the pentagram in the star in the center of the temple. Now in the center of the star is an altar, and on the altar is a Bible. Talk about blasphemy. And it's not always a Bible. Sometimes they have the Quran, and sometimes they've had other occultic books. So the altar is not reserved only for the Christian Bible. And the Bible that they use, and a lot of Masons have in their home, is filled with blasphemous and non-Christian information. And it's just enough to confuse a person and sway them into their truth. And it's exactly what I'm seeing in the NAR churches, how they twist it enough to make what they're doing okay. So it's like, okay, if you look at one piece of it and make that okay, fine. But dig deeper, go further back, look at the connections, because this stuff is real. People think, oh, you're crazy, you're talking about Satanism, blah, blah, blah. But these are the same people that would come to me and want a reading and ask me to tell them their future or answer questions for them. So it's like, where's the line here? There is no boundary. Whereas Christ draws a very clear boundary literally in the sand for us. And he is the only way, I'm telling you. Since I've been on my walk, straight and narrow, life is so much easier. Stress, anxiety, all that magic out of my life and discombobulating my mind is so freeing. It's amazing. Not that it's always easy, but it's so freeing. Just staying away from it is just like, oh, I can breathe. I don't have to be responsible for all of this space holding, right, for people. They like to obligate you. And that's what I'm getting to. So they put me in this role that was very, very relevant to where I was coming to in my life. Because the character of Electa in the Bible, she actually says in the ceremony, which I had to learn and memorize, that she had been reared a pagan, but became a Christian. And here I was right in that walk in my life, but they didn't know that. So isn't that interesting that I was put in that role? And it really, I was like, oh, this speaks to me. And so hook, line, and sinker, It's like, oh, this is the knowledge that God was saying he wants us to have, blah, blah, blah. And so being from the New Age and not really having instruction, it was very confusing. And though I love the people on YouTube, they help me a lot, it's really important to have a personal pastor. It's important to have a church to go to that is dividing the scriptures properly. And so I'm so grateful I have that. And there are online pastors that I have personal relationships with, not just the online information, that I love to ask questions to. And sorry if I drive you guys crazy, but to go personally to someone is so important, to not just dig into what you want answers to, because oftentimes we'll look for the answer we want and not the answer that's actually biblical. And that's the important piece that I always want people to come back to. So after I was electa for a year or so, I was asked to move up again, and I wasn't ready. Unfortunately, they backed off, but eventually they did move me up, spoiler alert. But I noticed towards the end of electa some things that bothered me. And the interesting thing about where her seat is in the temple was I couldn't see what was going on. So I'm involved in all these ceremonies and I could hear everybody, but where I was seated was almost towards the front of the temple, and so I couldn't see behind me. All I had visual of was the worthy matron, who's the leader, the worthy patron, her co-leader, the pianist and secretary roles were in front of me. So all the action was conveniently hidden from me. Now, the people that were involved in the Eastern Star, they didn't know that was happening, I'm telling you. But after I got moved into a different position, I realized all that had been hidden from me, because I truly believe had I seen it sooner, I would have recognized it. But regardless, I recognized it, and I'm super grateful for that. But I was also hesitant to move into this new position. It was overwhelming to learn a whole new part, because it is a lot of memorization. All of the ceremonies have to be memorized. This is the book that they give you right upon initiation. And these 5 ribbons are given to you as you go through the labyrinth, and each goddess gives you the ribbon that coordinates with her. Notice the snake in the middle of this. That's an important thing. I don't know if you can see that very well. I'll try to put a better picture up. Hopefully that's better. The snake is a big deal because they try to dismiss it as medicine in the New Age movement, right? Or other ways. But they don't understand that Solomon actually is the one who brought snakes into the temple. He practiced necromantic magic and healing. And so he would bring people into the temple that were very sick, but not him specifically. They brought in these special doctors, and there's history on that. If I can find a good documentary, I'll link it below. But the doctor would bring people in, and they'd put the sign above it that said, "Death is not welcome here." New Agers and doctors took that to mean that, oh, we're going to cure death, meaning you're not welcome to die. We're going to fix it. No, that's actually not what they meant. They wouldn't let really sick, actual terminal patients come in because they didn't want people to know that they were frauds. So they would put death not welcome here, meaning if you're dying, you can't come in. That's actually what that means. Don't believe me? Look into it, please. So I just find it interesting that that's part of the Eastern Star emblem on the front of our book. So we're given this book, and this book, this looks little, but it is full of stuff. Look at that first symbol, first page, boom, okay? And the writing is little, it's like a little Gideon's Bible, okay? So this is, we have to memorize this. And one of the things that some people call it a conspiracy theory, but if you study about Dr. Rob Morris, he studied a lot of the Islamic background and Muslim Brotherhood, and it said that he became a Muslim at one point. I don't know if that's true, but if you research that and coordinate it with the Order of the Eastern Star, there's a lot of similarities there. There's also a legend that he started the Order of the Eastern Star because women were complaining that they had no role in the Freemasons, because the men were not allowed to go home and tell their wives anything. That's another red flag. Think about it. in marriage, according to the Bible, you're not supposed to keep any secrets from each other. And I wasn't married and I'm not married, but so I became a member. That didn't occur to me as an issue until somebody mentioned it to me, and I was like, oh, wait a second here. What if I did get married to a non-member? Would I be able to tell them anything? And then their answer to me is, well, just make them a member. That's their answer, is initiate, right? They want to bring everybody in under this guise of servitude, but really it's to pull us away from our walk from Christ. You spend so much time memorizing this book that you're not spending time in your Bible. And that occurred to me before I was actually moved into my new role. And that hesitation was something that the New Age likes to prey upon, the empathy thing, right? Empathy is dangerous. Sympathy, appropriate and healthy where placed. Empathy, that is the devil's tool. And he used it heavy on me. So beware of empathy. Back to memorization. What's interesting is not everything is in here. There's a lot you have to learn that's only mouth to ear. So as soon as you're initiated, you're given a mentor or a tutor, and you spend a lot of time with this person memorizing signs, symbols, passwords, codes, movements, all these ceremonies, how to get from point A to point Z throughout the entire process. It's extremely militant. And for me, I ate it up because my background's martial arts. And so I was like, hey, this is great. This makes sense to me. I like that everybody has to do their part. As a choreographer in the dance industry, I really loved that everybody was required to learn their part. That really hooked me in, because I was always that person in college where there's the group of 5 and you have to do the project and there's one person who gets it done. Me. So being with people who were all getting it done was extremely attractive. And again, that word, seductive. So it's really interesting that in this book, there's a lot of stuff not written in there. So if you find one at a yard sale or even at a bookstore, you're probably getting the actual book, because you can order one. You can find these. These are not hard to find, and they're not illegal to possess. But there's a lot of information that's not in there, and a lot of pieces attach. So it can be a little bit confusing and misleading if you don't have all the pieces. So I'm trying to help out with some of those pieces. There is so much to talk about here that I did my best to bring it down to the important core aspects. So the labyrinth really got my attention when I was moved into a different role. So I was moved into associate conductress, which is one step away from the conductress, which is their voice of saying, we want you to be worthy matron very soon. And so they would have meetings about me trying to discuss how to get me into that role as quickly as possible. They need new people for that reason. It's very cult-like, and it's just interesting. They get together and they think they're being helpful, but really they're discussing how to manipulate a person into the role. And again, they mean well, but it's dangerous, and that's what I'm speaking to. So I can't say no, and I was like, okay, yeah, of course I'll take on this new role. What's the problem? So I took on the new role. And what bothered me was when I had to read the opening part of the initiation ceremony to a new initiate. And I talk about that here. Here's just another view of the temple next to the firehouse. And in a little bit, we're going to get into this book, which is the temple book. Hey, I don't know how well the sound's going to be, but I thought I would just go ahead and have a seat up here on the temple steps and read to you out of my book here, the Ceremonial Mason's Handbook. A lot of people ask me, how could you get involved in something like that? And the short answer is you really don't know what you're getting involved in, which is the case with most cults, until hopefully you have an awakening moment where you're like, wait a second, something's off here. Or you're willing to listen to people before you get into it. And then there's the third option, which is people never really figure it out, which is a bummer. But again, like I've said before, I don't think that just because people are Masons that they're Satanists or going to hell. One of the biggest issues is that when you join Freemasons, whatever group you join, whether you're female or male, they ask you one basic question. They ask if you believe in a higher power. And they don't define what that higher power is. They don't care where it comes from. And that can be really misleading initially. So when I had my moment where I was like, wait a second, something's up, it's when I was actually moved up in the order into a new position last year. And in that, I had to give a speech to a new initiate before they entered the temple for their initiation. And that's where my story got really, really crazy and hectic and quite frightening, actually. So one of the things that I had to ask in this long speech, and a lot of people know that you're supposed to memorize everything with the Freemasons. You're not allowed to take your books into ceremony. And that was a critical aspect of this particular night that happened for me when I realized, hold on, what am I involved in? So part of the speech I give to this person who's coming into their initiation, I'm just going to read it to you guys, in fact. So it's misleading in the way that it sounds really good and exciting and, oh, I'm gonna really expand my knowledge and do things for the better. So my role was associate conductress. I had been moved out of the star. I was a star officer, electa, and I'll talk about that as well. But this is about associate conductress while I'm sitting here on the steps. My friend, you are doubtless a seeker after light, or you would not have applied for membership in an organization which has for its inspiration the star in the east. You, like the three wise men, have been led by that light. Life is a labyrinth through which we would wander blindly, were it not for an all-seeing eye that watches over us and an all-powerful hand that guides us on our way. Sounds nice, doesn't it? This order is founded on a belief in the existence of a supreme being that rules the universe for good, and no one can become a member of the order who does not hold this belief. Therefore, before I can guide you to the chapter room, you must give me a brief and truthful answer to the following question. Do you believe in the existence of a supreme being? That's it. That's the question. Typically, they just answer yes, without anything else. And it continues, blah, 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 blah. So, just thought that was interesting. Now, the new initiate is then led through a labyrinth. And the labyrinth is not good, especially once I saw it from the side. Before I had been a part of the labyrinth, I was an active officer in the actual labyrinth part of the initiation, which takes like over an hour. And it's really crazy because time just doesn't even seem to drag on when you're in these ceremonies. It's almost creepy. So they go through this labyrinth, and that'll be coming up. But what's interesting is after they go through the labyrinth, then they're brought to the worthy matron's assistant, which is the worthy patron, and he then gives her instruction, or him. And what's interesting is they start the conversation with, we're going to teach you this stuff, but without these assurances from you, we wouldn't be able to give you these secrets. That's the short version of this long speech they give. And immediately they talk about, having secret handshakes and secret signs and all that stuff. And it's so overwhelming. You're like in a trance when you go through this ceremony. And what he basically says is, here we may share at this point. It is with pleasure that I welcome you into this chapter. Blah, 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 merit, honor, blah, blah, blah. Here we may share with our Masonic brothers and promulgating the principles of brotherly love, relief, and truth. Blah, blah, blah. By means of secret signs and other work of the order, we are able to make ourselves known to each other wherever we meet. We are governed by the laws and regulations of the Grand Chapter and by a code of bylaws framed by ourselves. These we are bound to obey so long as we remain members of the order. And in this obedience we shall expect you to share. So for those of you who are worried about my safety and well-being, I'm not a member of the order anymore. I left, I withdrew my membership, and so technically I'm not bound by any of these rules, laws, whatsoever. So that's kind of nice. He goes on to say a couple things. And again, this is after the person's already gone through this labyrinth. They've already given a commitment, okay? They haven't even been told anything yet, and they're already making these promises and oaths and all sorts of stuff. Okay, so this goes on. So this is like, you know, in the second hour, the worthy patron then takes a gavel and addresses the candidate. And the obligation you are about to take, okay, so you've already made these commitments, so this is kind of an oxymoron. The obligation you are about to take is a solemn pledge which you must give to this chapter before you can participate in the privileges of our order. By it, you bind yourself to the most solemn secrecy respecting the work of the order and to the performance of those acts of kindness and forbearance, which are essential to our welfare and prosperity. So it just continues on with all these like binding agreements. And, you know, I wouldn't be sharing this if it wasn't some messed up stuff. So some people might just hear these things and not make a big deal out of it. It just sounds like any other fraternity and whatnot. And it does. Like when you break everything down into small pieces, it doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you put it all together, and what do you got? You got some scary stuff. So those are just a few things I wanted to share with you out of the book, the initiation ceremony chapter. And I'll be sharing some other things along the way. Okay, so that happened to me just last fall when I was moved into that role, and we'd had a couple of meetings that weren't initiation ceremonies. So I didn't really notice the details in my part until that night. And that's when I freaked out and I did not go back. Spoiler alert. So I wanted to take that initiate and tell her to run. And I kind of wish I had. I wish I'd have taken her out with me and just got in my car and been like, we're out of here. But I did not. So I apologize for that failure. But I'm moving forward with this information now to hopefully help others, like I said, who are already involved in the lodge, in the temple, or those who are considering it. And again, if you have somebody who's involved, just pray for them. And Jesus works wonders through prayer. After the initiation, like I said, everybody was blabbermouths. So I was able to put a lot of that information together while I was watching the ceremony from a different perspective. So my new seat was out of the labyrinth and in the side of the temple. So I could see everything. It was like Shakespeare showed up and all the world was a stage. And I watched it and I really tried to stay clear, and I caught how I was getting lulled in, and then I'd kind of be like, wait, what? And then lulled in, and then wait, what? And what's interesting is we're not typically allowed to have our handbooks in during ceremony, but I had just been moved in this position, and for the life of me, I could not memorize my part. I have a crazy photographic memory, and as a dancer, choreographer, and all that good stuff, I memorize fast and I can see things and I just put it together quickly. That's one of my gifts. And again, as a choreographer, that's where I often used it. And that's where God used it with me that night. I was able to really watch it. And so because I couldn't memorize everything, I was protected through this moment. So I went to my worthy matron that night and I was like, I can't memorize this. And she knows I'm good at it. And she's like, that's interesting for you. She goes, well, I don't want to stress you out. So just bring your book in. It's no big deal. So I brought my book in per the great Grand Poobah's okay. And other people didn't like that though. It was interesting to see the dirty looks I got and just kind of nasty faces. So the love bomb disappeared real quick. Also, I was treated differently by the women that were part of the Ladies of the Labyrinth after I was moved out of the star. They weren't as friendly to me. It was a very interesting shift, and it's like, okay, noted. So I have my book with me during the ceremony, and as I notice the change in the 5 women who play the roles of Ada, Martha, Electa, Esther, and Ruth, not in that order, sorry, I noticed they changed. And then I noticed the pattern that the initiate was being walked through. The change I noticed in particular was the second point of the star is an elderly woman, and she came in a wheelchair and then to her seat in a walker and could barely move. And she was picked up from the rest home and brought to ceremony. These people are so committed. They won't get to church, but they'll get to the Masonic temple for ceremony. And that was another red flag for me. And I loved this woman. She was adorable and she was a riot. But what I saw really threw me off. Again, because I had been in a seat where I didn't see this before. So remember, she's initially got to her seat by a walker. It gets to her part, which is several pages long, that she has memorized and has to recite with these signs and emblems and symbols. And she got up, not barely able to have a sentence before this, and just, you saw this glaze go across her face. And she just went boom and didn't blink for like 3 minutes and just told this whole part. And the sign is this, and the color relevant is this, and the pass is this. And I was just like, whoa. And then you saw her kind of like come to herself, and I saw her look around and looked confused, and then she sat down again. So she pops up within perfect health, does this entire recitation, which takes, like I said, several minutes, because the entire labyrinth section alone is like an hour. And then just sits down, calm, cool, and collect. But then it was like Yoda in Star Wars, right? Where he goes through that crazy sword fight, the saber fight, where he's like, whoa, all the way through the room, and then just goes back to hunched over and grabs his his cane and hobbles off. That was what was going through my mind. I have a very vivid cartoon mind. That's what I saw. And I think that saves my sanity, because it frightened me too. I will admit, I work through fear and humor all the time. So those people who know me can appreciate that. I'm a smart aleck, and oftentimes when it's not appropriate to be. I would like to show you what this labyrinth looks like and why I think it's an issue. And there's obligations. There's a part where they go through the labyrinth. There's a part where there's from the altar to the 5 different goddesses, as they're told. And the reason I want to show you this is because of the shape that the labyrinth actually makes. This is just a symbol of one of the pages when the initiate is walked from Ada to Ruth. Notice the pentagram. Notice the middle of the pentagram is the altar. So this is just one part of the ceremony. And there's all, like I said, over an hour long of this actual pentagram where they walk a constant pattern to make a full pentagram. That really bothered me. And when I looked up at one point, I noticed one of the sisters in the pentacle glaring at me, because at that point I had taken my book and was carefully looking at it while watching the ceremony, and it didn't look like my friend at all. Her face changed. She looked so mean girl evil that I really wanted to be like, what's your damage, Heather? I felt like I was in junior high all over again. And I put my book down, and her glare just changed, and she just kind of looked at me, and then she just watched me the rest of the time, just really watched me. She didn't like me at all. And then when the ceremony was over, I actually approached her later that night, and I asked if I did something wrong, and she had no recollection. She was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, during ceremony, you seemed upset with me because I had to refer to my book. She goes, no, I didn't. You were glaring at me the whole time that the pinnacle was working. No, I wasn't. So she was checked out too, and that really affected me. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. So that happened, but also I'm sitting there, the ceremony's continuing on. After she had walked the entire labyrinth, then they're presented to the worthy patron. And then they give another obligation. There's like 10 obligations. But what's interesting is he goes in to explain all of the colors and all of the symbols and how they're all relevant to each other. And that's a very important aspect because that is witchcraft. That is straight up witchcraft. He refers to the goddesses of the labyrinth and how they're relevant to her walk and her remembrance and her identity. And it's this like me thing shows up and all this, oh wow. And you're being inducted and invoked and all these things are supposedly happening. And this is what the worthy patron says. So then the sister is presented to pretty much everybody in the room. But as she's at the front talking basically to the worthy patron, which is another probably half an hour, he actually gives a lesson during this time. And it's another neon sign. It's a full, huge circle sign with a pentagram. And it has all the colors that light up with the appropriate meanings and the deities and the flowers associated with them. And like the broken column is about self. It's not, doesn't refer to the broken column of Christ's support. It's this broken column of universal truth. So it's the slow programming through a very heavy duty ceremony. The ceremony is thick. And unfortunately, I have witnessed this ceremony in pieces, not in its entirety, throughout my life. I had been invited to many satanic ceremonies because as a witch, it was like, oh, okay, well, these are just my, brothers from another mother, however you want to put it. Because a lot of Satanists, including the ones that are involved in Masonry, don't often refer to themselves as that. They often call themselves Luciferians. And also they call it the fairy culture. So a lot of people are involved in that and they give it these names to soften it. But now everybody's just out front with it. Like, yeah, I'm a Satanist. And so that's a big part of that connecting piece. I think people need to understand. And a lot of people try to dismiss witchcraft saying, oh, there's no devil in the craft. I beg to differ 100%. The devil is the craft. He seducted through the original witch Semiramis. There's a whole story on her. Do your own research if you want on that. I've talked a little bit about her, but it's just what it is. And it's just the same stuff being modified and changed constantly. And that's the thing with the New Age. It's constantly changing. So people want to know these great mysteries. And that's why it's this great mystery. Whereas Jesus doesn't change. He's consistent. And what's beautiful is he's already won this battle. That's the reason we're told not to dabble in all this. Not because of Christian control. God's like, I've already won this war. I've already won it. Just knock it off. You're digging into stuff that's not going to help you. It's going to complicate your life. And it does. When I loved the Masons, it was like I had my life back. I had time back. I had my brain back. I wasn't Masons on my mind all the time. And that's a big thing with cults is they take over your time and your mind and eventually your spirit. So that's my warning and why I'm even talking about this. Again, I came in from magic, not from Christian to magic to Christian. So that's kind of that. If you've watched my testimony video, you'll know I have a deep history with Christ and Christianity, but pulled off that path so many times by the New Age. So that's kind of where I'm coming from or why I'm speaking to this. So as I'm sitting there watching this ceremony, what really affected me was I felt this entity walk through the building. And I had quit doing readings for people at this point because I was desperately trying to get on my walk with Christ. And I saw this Baphomet figure in the lodge. And they have a physical Baphomet figure and some neon signs, and they refer to Baphomet quite a bit with different names. But I actually saw, maybe people might say it was Lucifer, but what was weird was I had to pretend like it didn't bother me. And I watched this character walk around this whole lodge, and it looked just like that. And I'm trying not to get emotional because I don't want to be a big wimp here, but it was scary. but I wasn't allowed to show my fear. Thank you, martial arts. Thank you, God. Thank God first. He helped me. Seriously, I was praying. I was like, oh my goodness. And to myself, because obviously the ceremony was going on. So I'm talking to myself, talking to God, going, this is scary. And I know he let me see this because I was waking up. I was not asleep during the ceremony. And so I was able to see what was actually going on and what was there. It was so creepy and so dark. And in the past, the ceremony had been so awesome. I loved it. I looked forward to it. It felt good. It was like all these pieces. And I'm sitting there and I just couldn't wait to get out of there. I was so scared. And I hadn't been this scared in a very long time. It takes quite a bit to frighten me. I'll be honest. And part of that is because I know I have God in my corner. I'm just not afraid of anything that's any outcome, because I know Jesus has already won. The battle's already won. I just got to focus on him. And he calls us to live a simple life. He doesn't call for all this complicated hand washing. That's where I think that we can easily be led away from Christianity or turned off initially from Christianity because of the misrepresentation. And the Freemasons definitely misrepresent Christianity, in my opinion. And we're taught in Christianity and in the Bible that that's what Satan loves to do. He loves to hijack successful systems and make them his own. And sometimes he just inserts himself enough to where there's 90% truth or 99% truth, but the rest of it is just enough dangerous to, to kill souls and to pull them and mislead us and others away from the Bible. And so I was back in my Bible heavier, and that's ultimately, I think, what really got my attention, was being able to see this is not biblical, what's going on in here. And then honoring how I felt, and then recognizing that I still can see things, unfortunately. I don't look for it like I used to as a psychic, but they show up, and I just pray about it, and I know that I can't be possessed, and I just pray for the Lord to keep me from being oppressed by these horrible things that I see. And as I'm seeing this Baphomet, call him Lucifer, call him Satan, call him wherever you want, showing up in the lodge as they're talking about him, is like, wait a second. And one of the words they like to use is Muhammad. Doesn't that sound an awful lot like Muhammad? And again, going back to the creator of the Order of the Eastern Star, he's known to have a lot of Far East, Middle Eastern connections. So, you got to see where it's coming from. It's interesting. And you just put all these pieces together and hopefully you go, oh, okay, this is a problem. Recognizing that you cannot worship two masters. You can't serve two masters. Matthew 6:24 refers to this. You can't serve two masters. And in the Masons, there's so many masters that it's silly. There's not just the worshipful master, as I was referring to earlier, but anybody who was a master gets to continue to be called a master. So that's interesting there. And again, that gets in the way of a lot of pride and ego. There's a lot of rank. There's a lot of all that competitiveness within the lodge. The oaths that you have to take are also unbiblical because, again, let's talk about Matthew. It's a good book. Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 is about where it starts. Talks about, oath taking, oath making, and all that good stuff. James in chapter 5 also talks about this. So I encourage you to go read your Bible and for yourself, and hopefully you have a church to go to or a pastor to go to. Missionary Spencer Smith on his website has a great resource for looking for a biblically sound church. So I encourage you to do that. So do not take an oath at all is basically what Jesus says. It's like we commit to Christ, but Christ made oaths to us. Jesus is like, you're not able to fulfill oath taking because you guys are living in a sinful nature. We fell. It's the whole reason that he came and offered his life for us on the cross. The whole gospel of Christ is because we're sinners and we're broken, and he knows we're going to continue along in our sin, and hopefully have circumcised hearts that change our behavior because of that. But that's ultimately the point, was that we don't need all these masters because Jesus is the only master. He came, took the sin upon himself. He's like, you're going to continue to screw up. Don't look for screwing up. Avoid screwing up. Don't run to screwing up. And just know that I'm there. I am he. And that is the most comforting thing to recognize, is that he knows that were messed up. You know, if you're a parent, like, you don't unlove your kid. You don't love your kid less because they make mistakes. If anything, we love them more because we hurt for them. It's the same way Christ feels for us. He's like, oh, kids, I just want you to come home. That's it. That's all there is to it. And I know it's more complicated than that. But the simplicity of it is ultimately what brought me out of the Masonic Lodge. So I encourage you, like I said, to look into those teachings, really look into your Bible, and consider those things that I've discussed in this little documentary type video I've put together. Not sure what I'll call it, but I appreciate the support and encouragement I've received from people. I would love to talk more about this subject if it's helpful, and to continue to dive in and dig deep with it, because there is so much to talk about. Like, how do you cover it all? And I know I missed a lot of stuff. I know I'm going to get through my notes and, oh, I wanted to talk about that. So please message me, spiritualwhiplash@gmail.com. I love the input. It helps me know what to talk about and what you're interested in. I'm just a small channel, just trying to share what my experiences are, what I love to study, and the world around me, and the world that tends to pull us in and away from our walk with Jesus Christ, or can keep us from discovering the love that Jesus has for us to begin with. It's just fully misrepresented throughout so many parts of our society that I hope I can speak to that. I have had a lot of experiences. I know I'm an unusual person. For 44 years of age, I recognize that, but I was an unusual child. Have to interview my mom sometime. She'd be funny to talk to. I always loved studying my whole life. I've just been a geek for knowledge and fascinated with religion and theology. Again, I spent my life in the entertainment world and around a lot of people. I traveled, and I love all of this stuff. When you're traveling, you typically have a lot of time to study. So I've always loved studying the Bible, even when I was a practicing witch. I loved studying magic, and so I was able to study a lot of old grimoires and connect it to what's happening in some of these cults now. So I'm grateful for that time. Even though I put out videos, even though I was a performer, I'm actually an introvert. I love people. I love being around them for short periods of time, but then I like to retreat. I like to study. I like to learn, and to be educated, actually, more than to educate. So even though I was a dance teacher and I taught martial arts, which I enjoyed, I am just a sponge. I love learning about the connections of the Bible and the history of man. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Again, God bless all of you. I may not know you, but I pray for you. And I don't know everything. I'm not purporting to, I'm not proclaiming to. So if you feel any of my information conflicts something that you might know, feel free to share in the comments below. I'm always open to learning more, and as I said, being educated further. But like I said, I like to stay the narrow gate and keep on that path. It's easier. And even though some people consider it boring, I'm never bored. And I like living in my consistent happiness, my calm life, and working on this information for y'all. So yeah, so if there's let me see, I'm just looking at my notes here to make sure, so that way I don't let you guys down. I think I covered most of it. So yeah, look up some people that are interesting about Masonry. Research Albert Pike. It's an interesting character. Research the star and crescent, like a lot of the symbols that are on Meriwether Lewis's apron. And study Baphomet. I encourage you to study Baphomet. So if you're interested in Masonry, these are some key elements. Study about Pergamum and the roots and the connection. It's not coincidence that Pergamum, the section of it with stairs and the seat of Satan, was moved to Germany in the 1930s, just in time for Hitler to kick off his fun. And Hitler was very into a lot of Masonic tradition. I did not know that until I was out and started studying deeper. So look into it for yourself. Feel free to, like I said, ask more questions, and I'll do my best to give answers. In the meantime, God bless.